Its surface blazes brightly, masking shadows below. Hello, and welcome to the Expanse. I'm H the Quack, and I hope you're having a less quack day than myself. Today we are going to be talking about World of Warcraft's God of the Sun, Archie, and his seeming absence in the World of Warcraft universe, and why it's important. We're doing this because, for me at least, the hints that something big is coming in relation to the Sun is so blatant, I can't ignore them anymore. Also, when I say big, by the way, I mean a threat that will probably eclipse the Legion and lore reveals that will be on par with the Chronicles. Also, for reference, this is what happens when something that should have only taken a day turns into sticking your head in the pond for over a week. This whole theory is beyond quacked. So, technically, all of this begins with the Tauren mythology, one of the oldest, by IRL standards, references to the creation of Azeroth. A set of myths that, for the most part, contradict everything we know about early Azeroth. To what extent these myths contradict our current knowledge comes down to when you think these stories took place. However, some of the implied facts within the text will always raise an eyebrow. Example being the Tauren myths imply the Tauren, Shahalo, have been around since the first days of Azeroth, as in pre-Black Empire and pre-Reign of the Elements. The aspect of the Tauren myths we're going to be focusing on today is Archie, the Sun, one of the eyes of the Earth Mother, Azeroth, and brother to Uldum, who is specifically venerated by the Seers and Sunwalkers within Tauren society, and is said to ensure the dawn every morning by bleeding his light into the sky with the help of the Yine. The notion Uldum has a brother who is assumedly as powerful as her is a very interesting notion in of itself. Here's the question though. Why is his presence seemingly absent from Azeroth in comparison to his sister? I mean, just as an example, there are a plethora of locations that have strong, known, and obvious connections to the moon. In comparison, Archie has 2 locations, which have only recently been added/explained. One of these places is the field of Archie in High Mountain, introduced in Legion. The other is Sunrock Retreat, in Stone Talon Mountain. According to legends, Archie kissed the mountain range of the retreat. There is also the fact Archie is only referenced in one of the older Tauren myths. No other species on Azeroth seems to acknowledge Archie or the existence of a sun deity, even though the sun basically shares the same rotation as the moon, which overall is foundationally strange. Even druids from multiple cultures that use lunar and solar powers do not seem to reference the sun. So, are the Tauren myths wrong? And is there no deity of the sun? Or was Archie conveniently forgotten about by every species on Azeroth? I don't think either happened. I think it's more likely Archie and references to a deity of the sun were stricken from the history of Azeroth. The questions are, why? Is there proof of it? And how will this play into the coming story of World of Warcraft? This is where a very long list of relevant lore starts to form our knowledge of the sun, and where this theory begins. The list starts with the Cataclysm. In Cataclysm, we are introduced to Uldum, a Titan facility that had been hinted at back in vanilla through the discs of Norgannon and Ulduman. At the time, Uldum was odd. We had just walked the halls of Ulduar in Wrath, so everyone had a general idea of what to expect from Titan architecture. Uldum blew that out of the water. On top of this, we had the Watchers of Uldum, who were not only animal-headed giants similar to the Anubiseth we had seen in AQ, but were also related to rather odd notions of magic and what they encompassed. The Watchers respectively represented magic, chaos, life, and the sun. Now, considering what we're talking about, Raj, the construct of the sun, was an interesting reveal. A falcon/eagle-headed humanoid being chosen to represent the sun is quite an obvious nod to the Egyptian god Ra, or Horus depending on your take, but most likely Ra in this case. And where this is important, what's initially interesting about these Watchers is that trying to equate them to the Titans we know of is a nightmare that doesn't really work. Trust me, I've tried. This is rather odd considering almost all Watchers on Azeroth, except the ones in Uldum, were made to reflect the Titans, raising the question, why are they different, and are these Watchers supposed to reflect something else? This is where a very, very subtle difference in Uldum's layout starts to become incredibly important. If you've been flying around Uldum, you've probably noticed these statues everywhere. Or have you noticed these ones? Yes, there are 2 different bird statues in Uldum, and yes, they are that important. Why? Well, let's start with the most common statue. The most common statue in Uldum is that of the Raven/Crow. And yes, I am certain it is either one or the other, and I will eventually explain why. During the original quests in Uldum, this raven is quite noticeable. As the quests of Uldum take you around the Obelisk of the Stars, it becomes clear there are at least 2 geographical markers associated with the raven, other than the raven statue. The first are the massive raven motifs carved into the walls of Uldum. The second are the raven obelisks that have an identical motif to the walls, and are specifically topped off with turquoise pyramids, which have unique designs carved into them. It should also be noted, these designs are distinct in comparison to the main obelisks of Uldum. The places of note the raven appears are the Obelisk of the Stars, Nahom, just south of the Obelisk of the Stars, an unnamed shrine just east of the Lost Sea of Tolvir on the southern coast, inside the August Terrace within the Lost Sea of Tolvir, the Cradle of the Ancients at the southern base of the Obelisk of the Sun, where during Cataclysm we accessed the Cradle of Promise, which contained the Titan discs used to activate the Halls of Origination, as well as the power to bring life to the desolate area. Fun fact, whoever redid Uldum overlooked that event, and reverted the area back to its arid state. This was even done for those who went through the entire questline of Uldum, which saw adventurers activate all the obelisks to gain access to the Cradle of Promise in the first place. The other notable places the raven appears is on the western base of the Obelisk of the Sun, in what seems to be a side entrance, inside the Forge of Origination, which, as you start the dungeon, seems to heavily imply the raven has something to do with the engine, and, most importantly, the Obelisk of the Moon, which out of all of the locations appears to be dedicated to the raven. This brings us to the Falcon/Hawk. On the outset, the Falcon statues in Uldum seem to be ornaments, and that's it. However, when you start to realize where these statues turn up and what they're connected to, a lot of questions start to appear. Shrines to the Falcon turn up in Ramkahet, the Lost City of Tolvir, and Neferset. So the implication here is the Tolvir know or at least acknowledge whatever this Falcon is. However, in comparison to the Raven, the Falcon scarcely appears outside and only in localized positions. The Falcon only appears outside in Neferset, the northern peak of the Obelisk of the Sun, the base of the northern ascent to the top of the Obelisk of the Moon, Orsis, the ruins of King Tasset, over the Obelisk of the Moon, specifically outside the Temple of Uldum, in Uldum, and just outside the Lost City of Tolvir. Now, the position of the Falcon in relation to the Obelisk of the Sun confirms something that wasn't very hard to put together. These Falcons are probably related to the Sun, and in turn, Watcher Raj. What the positioning of these Falcons also do is show a distinct separation between the Raven and the Falcon. Rarely do both appear in the same location, and even if they do, one is usually more predominant than the other. The only exceptions to that rule are the ruins of King Tasset, above the Obelisk of the Moon, prior to the Akia moving in and removing them, and the Lost City of Tolvir. During Cataclysm, we defeated an Obsidian Colossus/Destroyer that had the head of a falcon within the ruins. The Destroyer was surrounded by falcon statues it appeared to have control over. The Destroyer was also activated by one of the crystals that were used to save the life of Assyrian the Asgard from AQ, but I'll go back to him later. The main point here is, for some reason, one of the only places the Raven and the Falcon coexist is above the Obelisk of the Moon, in a ruin where the Raven seems to guard both sides of both doors, a place that in the past and present was used to create different types of Obsidian Destroyers. The other place the Raven and the Falcon seemingly exist is in the Lost Sea of Tolvir. In the Warlord's Terrace, there is a shrine to the Falcon guarded by 2 assumedly Ivory Watchers, while in the August Terrace, keep that name in mind, there are Raven statues looking over the area. The definition of an Augur, I might add, is a religious official who observed natural signs, especially the behaviour of birds, interpreting these actions as indications of divine approval or disapproval of proposed actions. Synonyms for Augur are seer, prophet, oracle, sage, diviner. What's intriguing about the birds coexisting in the Lost City is that the third boss of the dungeon, Prophet Barim, is one of the few bosses in Cataclysm that had relation to the birds. Barim specifically calls upon the powers of a phoenix and a dark phoenix, and upon his death says the famous line, "Death is only the beginning." Also, if you played during Cataclysm, I'm almost certain you remember the seemingly out-of-place additions of the normal and dark Firehawk mounts, as well as the dark Phoenix mount, which at the time were highly coveted and difficult to acquire. What was odd about them was, other than Barim, Alreza and Raj to an extent, their additions had little to no connection to the expansion, especially when you say compared them to the Drakes of the Winds mounts that were also added in Cataclysm. It should also be noted, the Pure Blood Firehawk flavor text reads as follows. Legends state that the Pure Blood line may be traced back to the very creation of the Firelands, implying the Firehawks were on Azeroth, at the very least during the fall of the Black Empire, if not longer, meaning their presence on Azeroth could quite easily predate the Titans. Now, if you're wondering how all of this relates to the theory, let me just make this perfectly clear first. We have a raven that is seemingly related to the stars and the moon, and a falcon that is seemingly related to the sun. Now, the general assumption about Uldum is the notion that the Tol'vir designed everything in reverence to the Titanic Watchers in the Halls of Origination. The idea is, statues like the falcon are worshipped in reverence of Raj and the Titanic Watchers. It's a reasonable assumption considering the Tol'vir are Titan forged and the Halls of Origination was created by the Titans. However, what if I told you that was wrong? What if I told you, similar to the question I asked earlier, the Watchers of Uldum, similar to the Watchers on Azeroth, are made to reflect something. Something that was. Something greater than the Watchers, and something the Titans couldn't ignore. You see, Uldum and the surrounding ruins, in of themselves, contradict the Watchers in the Halls of Origination being the true deities of the Tol'vir, whether the Tol'vir know it or not, and instead hint that, like the other statues throughout Uldum, the Watchers are designed to be in reverence of something greater, albeit designed by a different civilization. The first dead giveaway this is the case is the Raven, and its seeming absence amongst the Uldum Watchers. Why? Well, there is a lot I need to go through before I can get to the line of logic I know you've probably already put together, so unfortunately I'll just say this for now. In Uldum, the Raven is attached to the moon and the stars. Yet, when you enter the Halls of Origination, there is only one Watcher that matches that description. That Watcher is Isa Set, the Watcher of Magic, the only Titan-looking Watcher in Uldum. The only Watcher that has 3 statues in all of Uldum. One at the entrance of Uldum, another at the entrance of the Halls of Origination, and the last in the Lost City of Tol'vir, seemingly placed within her own garden. And she is the only Watcher to actively hide her ears. Couple this with the fact that 8.3 has confirmed the Obelisk of the Stars can be used to ascend creatures to a Titan-like status. The Engine of Nalik Shah previously proved the Titans can alter the forms of these stars, and the constellation Corvus, the Raven, also just happens to be in the Ulduar Forges. It's not that much of a stretch to figure out what happened to the Raven. The joke is, there is more supporting evidence to this that I will touch on later. In the meantime, the second dead giveaway Uldum provides, that implies the Watchers were based off creatures before them, is a location called the Tomb of the Precursors, where you can seemingly find tombs dedicated to each of the animals except the falcon. This concept in of itself makes no sense in relation to the Titan Forged. We know the Tol'vir were Titan Forged, implying when they came south, they apparently quote-unquote built Uldum and the prison of Thun. So, for there to be the tombs of the precursors means those tombs have to be old, as in Black Empire old or older. And where the argument could be made, the precursors were the Tol'vir present before Uldum was re-originated, thanks to archaeology and the Castle of Sand, we know that is not likely the case. The Castle of Sand implies the buildings in the area of the tomb of the precursors are old enough that not even the Tol'vir, who have been locked away in the region for millennia, have the basic plans or techniques to create or maintain the buildings. Not mentioning the fact that, once again, these castles of sand also just happen to appear in the Lost Sea of Tol'vir. and where the obvious answer to all of this is the Tol'vir are just a reverse Titanforged species from the Black Empire, as the underlying design of Uldum quite literally looks like a Black Empire capital repurposed by the Titanforged. That answer also quickly makes little to no sense, because most of the buildings in Uldum are dedicated to the sun. Not a dark sun, I might add, a quite bright and vibrant sun, a thing the Shadow is quite obviously not a fan of. Though, that's not mentioning the basic fact there is no way the Titans would create watches in the image of the old gods. Though I don't even really need to mention that either, because none of the watches look like the old gods anyway. All of this leaves a big question mark above Uldum, as it implies something as old as the Black Empire, or at least something old enough to mimic their architecture consistently, was around during the early days of Azeroth. The question is, who or what? This brings us to Osirian the Unscarred, who is more of a sun reference than Raj. Now, Osirian was an Anubiseth, as in a jackal-faced giant Anubiseth. After being the first Anubiseth to bring down a dragon during the War of the Shifting Sands, Osirian was changed as he nearly died bringing down the dragon that was slain. This change resulted in his current form. Now, this type of transformation occurring to minions of the old gods is nothing new. There's just one very odd thing about Osirian's transformation. Osirian looks nothing like an old god minion. As in, whatever Sethun and the Twin Emperors did to Osirian was not of the Shadow. They turned an Anubiseth into a hawk-headed giant that looks like it was made to revere the sun, with crystals that are described as being of distant origin. That's it. The only other time a crystal like that turns up in WoW is, as I mentioned, when we fight a falcon-headed obsidian colossal / destroyer in Cataclysm. So, not only are these crystals incredibly rare, they also seem to have connections to the sun, the falcon / hawk, and the ability to alter a creature's form to look like a falcon / hawk. The reason this is important is that it should get you thinking about how the Titans created the forms of Raj and the other Watchers in Uldum. But more importantly, it should get you thinking about when and where these crystals are from and why they have such an effect. The Titans may have used these crystals, but to our knowledge, the Titans used the Forges to create the Watchers. So if the crystals were used by the Titans, they would have assumedly served a different purpose than transforming Titanforged. But what this still doesn't explain is the properties of the transformation, as in why a falcon / hawk. As for the old gods and the Black Empire, it seems as if they know how to use the crystals similar to the Titans, but once again the effects don't match the entities. Once again, why a falcon / hawk? The only solid connection these crystals have to anything on Azeroth is the result of their effect, which connects them to the falcon / hawk and the sun. The implication here is, similar to the Tomb of the Precursors, these crystals and their effect might date back or predate the Titans' interference on Azeroth, if not the Black Empire as well, in turn implying the existence of an old creature a Titan construct like Raj may have been built to reflect. This is further implied by Tanaris. World of Warcraft has few areas that from vanilla have never been changed. South Tanaris is one of those locations. Other than the addition of NPCs and a slight change of map proportions to ensure the Uldum entrance could fit, South Tanaris has remained relatively the same. This area is important because of the South Moon and East Moon ruins just north of the Valley of the Watchers. These ruins are troll ruins, but, as the name suggests, these ruins are dedicated to the moon, which, for the Faraki, who were technically jungle trolls considering their heritage, is very, very weird. As in, yes, there are the Lunalize and Adlari, but for the most part, they are an outlier in troll society that have little sway. There could be an argument made that these ruins once belonged to the Dark Trolls, who eventually became Night Elves, but if the maps of early Azeroth are correct, then Tanaris was controlled by the Gurubashi Jungle Trolls. So, as extreme outliers go, these ruins fit the bill. These ruins lead to an interesting implication surrounding the Faraki Trolls of Tanaris and their pantheon. You see, the Faraki in comparison to the other major troll tribes are severely lacking in lore, as in we have Moizala, Kimball, and Shadra, and technically Gazrilla, though as Yasma implied, the worship of the Hydra in normal troll society is heavily looked down upon. Seemingly, it is something specific to the Faraki and heretics like the followers of Xul. Either way, the Faraki pantheon for a tribe that occupies Xul is extraordinarily small, a fact which fundamentally has never made any sense. I mean, even though the Faraki are technically an offshoot of the Gurubashi, they were never as small as, say, the Darkspear or any of the other offshoot tribes. So their pantheon shrinking due to numbers doesn't make much sense, and neither does their location being too remote for worship, as worship of the lower is practically universal. So the question becomes, what happened to the lower of the Faraki? Well, assuming South Moon and East Moon ruins were once occupied by the Faraki, and in turn the Faraki at some point had temples dedicated to the worship of the moon, then the Raven/Crow being an entity the Faraki worshipped would make a lot of sense considering their proximity to the Valley of the Watchers and Uldum. This would also explain why the Faraki and Traveler had a method of using the moon to summon dark versions of Kimball and Shadra, as well as Moizala. It also just happens that if you add the Jackal, the Ram, the Falcon, and the Crocodile, if you really want to push it, on top of the Raven, the Faraki pantheon starts to look a lot more complete. Here's the icing on the cake though. Zul'Gurub is just adjacent to Karazhan. Now, thanks to Lhok from Shinies and Lucydos, I've known for ages that if you attempt to translate an IRL meaning out of Karazhan, one of the more interesting translations you can pull from the word is Karasu, which means raven in Japanese. Now, as translations go, that fits the theme of Karazhan very well. The reason we're paying attention to this though is thanks to the Deadwind Harvester and the information we learn about it in Legion, we know that before the Harvester scoured what would become known as the Deadwind Pass, there was a heavy troll presence in the area. We don't know what they were doing in the area, but considering everything I've just been through with the Faraki, it wouldn't be that surprising if the Gurubashi at some point worshipped the Raven as well. There is also the fun fact that the Falcon, or more precisely the Eagle, is already a part of the oddest troll pantheon out there, the Armani pantheon. And where a Killzone, the Armani Eagle Lower, doesn't have a direct connection to the sun, and instead a connection to lightning, it is intriguing how the Armani also have the fire-based Dragonhawk Lower, Janali. I should also note now, the Wild Gods are a pantheon of Lower that were specifically bound to the Emerald Dream. Freya, the Keeper of Aeonar, specifically chose the Lower that would become the Wild Gods. Where at present there is no solid proof the other keepers took such an action with another set of Lower, for the rest of this theory I would highly suggest keeping in mind that one of the other keepers may have done so. Overall, this possible connection to the Faraki pantheon once again gives us a plausible creature the constructs of Uldum may have been designed to reflect, while also expanding the possible presence of these deities outside of Uldum. If you're also curious why I did mention Zuldrak or Zandalar, it's not because they don't have anything to do with this theory, it's actually quite the opposite. It's just that when I get to a certain part of this theory and introduce Zuldrak and Zandalar, if you know your lore, all of this is going to click really fast. So until then, the last thing that implies the Watchers of Uldum are not the gods of Uldum, or that which Uldum is dedicated to, is the Amentet. You see, the minute the Amentet come out of stasis and find Raj and the other Watchers dead, instead of the typical mixture of dismay, reverence and anger you'd expect from worshippers of a faith knowing their literal deities are dead, the Amentet instead display a near total lack of respect for their supposed gods, and instead attempt to build their own Watchers and replace them, touting loyalty to the Titans and notions the Titans' plans must be followed. This implies the Amentet and assumedly the other Tol'vir know the Watchers are tools, constructs which may have been given personalities and great purpose by the Titans, but at the end of the day are still completely replaceable. Now, what's interesting about this is that where the Watchers may get that type of treatment, the non-statues don't. In actuality, they get the complete opposite. Above the tombs of the Amentet in an area called the Sunstone Terrace, of all the names I am going to ask you to remember that name, Sunstone Terrace. In 8.3, a new addition was added to the area. That addition was a shrine to the falcon created by the Amethet. What's interesting is a broken pillar of the raven was also added, specifically set in a way that makes it look like the Amethet defaced the pillar and replaced it with the falcon shrine. Couple this with the fact the Amethet's pets are sun-touched falcons, and they are using sun pillars, topped with the very sun pyramids that had been sparsely scattered around Uldum since Cataclysm, and almost match every mimicked sun pyramid top in Uldum, the writing on the wall seems to be pretty obvious. Even though the Amethet are quite obviously Titanforged and zealously loyal to the Titan's plans, the Amethet also have a connection to the Falcon and the Sun, and treat the Falcon and the Raven more like gods than the Watchers. On top of this, considering the constant references to the Sun everywhere in Uldum, yet the seeming prevalence of the Raven and lack of the Falcon, the implication here seems to be there was a shift in worship from both to one to seemingly neither, leaving the very big questions of who or what, when, and why. Beginning with the who and the what, we start with the very glaring implication I've been touting ever since I mentioned the Raven seemingly being connected to the moon and the Falcon seemingly being connected to the sun. Or more directly, am I saying Elune is a Raven and Anshe is a Falcon? The short answer is technically yes, and to explain that, we're going back to everyone's favourite expansion, WoD. So this notion of a falcon/hawk, or more precisely if we're going for the lore-specific term, a firebird, being related to the sun, and the idea of a raven and firebird being excessively powerful, lower-like gods, which had their own ancient culture and civilization built around them, is not new. These notions were actually explored on a planet called Rakshar, or to translate, Sunstone. We know that planet as Draenor. The gods of the Arrakoa, Rukma, a sun-related white-fire firebird, I'm just going to say phoenix from now on, Anzu, an arcane-related raven, and Seath, a shadow-related wind serpent. These three were the equivalent of lower/wild gods on Draenor and were excessively powerful. To give an example, Rukma created the Arrakoa out of birds, Seath created a curse that not only lasted millennia but could also permanently warp the Arrakoa and the other gods into flightless birds, and Anzu, where he lacked power, was clever enough to get creatures of the light and the shadow to work together. Now, am I saying these specific gods existed on Azeroth? No. Am I saying similar gods existed on Azeroth? Yes. Why? Well, because we've had confirmation for over a decade that Azeroth and Draenor share similar ley lines, and in turn a similar genesis, as in origin. And where there is an astounding amount of stuff I could go through that proves this, I'm just going to focus on the Arrakoa and state a few factual statements about them and see if they sound familiar. The Arrakoa are technically the chosen of the sun, technically the children of the sun. Or more precisely, when Rukma died, she looked like a second sun, and prior to that, the Arrakoa thought of her as a sun goddess and thought of her as the origin of light magic. Sound familiar? How about this? The Arrakoa initially created a light/arcane based civilization that over time eventually incorporated shadow magic. How about this? The Arrakoa dedicated their civilization to their god and built massive structures as their new homes. Not only this though, they were explorers that mapped out Draenor in the name of curiosity and fascination. Oh, and they were extremely arrogant, seeing themselves above any land dweller on Draenor. They also managed to destroy their civilization through civil war. That I bet didn't destroy the planet, but did decimate their capital and homeland. These statements go on, but at this point I'm hoping the similarities between the Night Elves and the Arrakoa are as plain as day. Otherwise, you might find the rest of this theory more crazy than it already is. And if you're curious why I haven't expanded upon Seath yet, wait for it. I guarantee it'll drop your jaw if you haven't already put two and two together. So at this point we have some circumstantial evidence that Elune and Anshe at the very least relate to a raven and falcon respectively. For the most part, this ties together everything I've mentioned in relation to Uldum, as it explains Elune and Anshe being on Azeroth, why they were related to birds, why they were worshipped, and why the two could have been around for such a long time, as their Draenor equivalents survived as a light and arcane lower during a time where no others could. There's just one big problem with all of this. Even when you consider all the circumstances surrounding the gods of the Arrakoa, and how they are supposed to be similar, no exact copies, just similar, Anzu and the Raven were never related to the moon or the light. So why in the world is the moon related to the Raven on Azeroth? This is where a very specific tidbit of information about the Arrakoa and Xal'atath's statement about Elune.
My mistake. It seems the upstart goddess still holds sway here. Oh well.
Near perfectly cross. The Outcasts, the flightless Arrakoa that recognize Anzu as a god, technically worshipped two Raven gods. One was Anzu, the other was Kalu, the Raven Mother, who, I'm not gonna lie, seemingly comes out of nowhere at the end of the Spires of Arrak, and as a fun fact, apparently New Draenor was going to be turned into Outland years before the fact. Kalu is a demigod, and was the consort of Anzu. He left her in charge of the Ravens before he hid himself from Rukmar. To give you an idea of who the Raven Mother is and why her personality is so important, here are two of the only quotes she states. Anzu always meddled in the affairs of mortals. One would think I might learn from his mistakes. Do you know why I allow these accursed, forgotten children of Rukmar to live among my flock? It is because I weep for them. They are trapped between two gods, one who fears and rejects them, and one who would enslave them to his dark will. Their only champion abandoned them long ago, and nobody has stood beside them since. Now, if that doesn't seem reminiscent of a certain goddess, here's a quote from Alaneth, the Arcane Mage legendary weapon. A dream of perfect beauty. Ridiculous. This world knows only pain, child. He says this when you place the Tear of Elune in the Tomb of Sargeras. Now, you remember how I said you can pretty much figure out what happened to the Raven in Uldum because of its corresponding statue amongst the Keepers being Isaset? I am hoping that's just clicked. There is a very real chance the Raven Mother of Azeroth was elevated to the position of the moon through the Obelisk of the Stars, possibly by the Titans, and was then altered in some fashion to match her current look and given a new name, specifically Elune. This leaves two questions. A. What happened to the Anzu equivalent on Azeroth? And B. Why in the world does Elune, the Raven Mother equivalent on Azeroth, seemingly have the powers of the sun? I mean, she was able to alter the forms of the Dark Trolls and turn them into the Kaldori, the children of the stars. She was also able to create the Boomkin, or in the case of the Zandalari, a form that looks identical to the Arrakoa. And if you didn't know, there are quests in the Desolus that show if you give blood sacrifices to Elune, she can grant you the power of a fiery vortex. As in, not the dark magic of the Night Warrior or the white light magic of the Priestesses, proper fire magic. The answer to the first question, what happened to the Anzu equivalent, is actually surprisingly easy. You remember how I mentioned Zul'Di and Zandalar had a connection, I just wanted to wait so when I mentioned them it'd click? Here's the question that ties them in. Does Azeroth have its own, evil, domineering, should never be worshipped or summoned wind serpent like Seath? The answer is yes, and it's a wind serpent you all know. Hakar. Instead of a falcon or a raven, what lower are in Zul'Di? The answer is 2 wind serpent lower. What's in Zul'Ji that's not in Zul'A? A shrine to Hakar, the wind serpent, the soul flayer, the blood god. The lower whose blood helped induce the nightmare in Green Dragons, and that isn't mentioning the corrupted blood incident. Hakar's blood is as dangerous as Seath's, and their personalities are almost identical. Why am I bringing up Seath in relation to Anzu? Well, as the story goes, to stop Seath from cursing the homeland of the Arrakoa, Arrak, with what remained of his blood and body after a failed attempt to steal Rukmar's power, Anzu devoured the Wind Serpent and his power. This act saved most of Arrak, except the Sethek Hollows, and unfortunately for Anzu, came at the cost of disfiguring his soul and form, ensuring he could never fly again. Now, looking at the Sethic Hollows, does this crazed Arrakoa blood-ridden Maya remind you of anywhere we've recently been in BFA? Personally, it reminds me of a very toned-down version of Nazmir. And when you consider Hakar's blood is stored in Uldir for no apparent reason, and the fact Rukmar moved the Arrakoa to the mountains of Gorgrod to avoid the Curse of Seath before reclaiming Arak later, and the Zandalari left Nazmir for the mountains of Zuldazar because blood magic destroyed their civilization, I don't think the similarities are supposed to be that surprising. This is where the Raven and the Shock comes in. Which Cunning Loa has their temple in Nazmir? Which Loa has unprecedented normal and spectral ravens all over their temple? Which Loa has a power that's considered a curse, has a very odd connection to blood and the wind serpents, and currently has a thing for a powerful priest that has magic seemingly related to the light? Yes, I am talking about Bwonsamdi, and yes, I do think he's Azeroth's Anzu equivalent. And yes, I am implying that I think at some point in time during the history of Azeroth, Hakar died in Nazmir, specifically on the location Uldir was built upon, and cursed the swamp in the process. Though when I finally get to the end of this theory, I guarantee that will be something you remember. Sticking to Bwonsamdi for now, have you ever wondered what those bones on Bwonsamdi's back are supposed to be? I mean, just to be clear, troll back ornaments are based off him. Those bones are attached and a part of Bwonsamdi. Now, I'm not going to say they are Arrakoan wings, but sticking with the similarities between Draenor and Azeroth, in Shadowlands we just got introduced to a new species that just conveniently has wings, and where I'm not 100% sure of the timeline here, the funny thing about the Kyrian is that at some point we have to have seen a basic or very close cousin of the Kyrian. Otherwise, we would only recognize the spirit healers and the Kyrian would look like formless spirits. And I mean, would it really be that surprising if the blood magic of another spiteful wind serpent destroyed the form and soul of another quote-unquote god who meddled in the affairs of mortals, and possibly cursed those that followed the god, or those the god was supposed to protect? If you do get to the end of this theory, this possibility will make a lot more sense. Anyway, Bwonsamdi, Alud, Anshe and Hakar. In my opinion, these are the most likely candidates for the Arrakoan god equivalents on Azeroth. With these equivocations established, we get the who/what in Anshe and Alud, the Phoenix and the Raven. This however returns us to the why and the minor who. Why have things turned out the way they have on Azeroth, and who's responsible? What saw Anshe stricken from the record and Alun seemingly gain the power of the sun, and for all intents and purposes literally take up a moon-like role in reflecting the sun's light? First instinctual response to this question is, it must have been the Titans. And I would agree with that. There is just one problem with that. The Tol'vir, specifically the Amentet, and the Uldum Watchers. The Amentet are Titanforged who specifically recognize the Titans, however have an extremely heavy connection to the power of the sun, implying the Titans were quite willing to use the sun's power and not shy away from it. While on the other hand, the Uldum Watchers, specifically Raj, follow this trend of using the sun's power, implying the same thing. So if not the Titans, then who? Once again, the short answer is the Keepers, specifically Tyr, or Tyr and Arcadis, but most likely Tyr. The other short answer is something older than we currently know of. Now, before I explain those statements, I need to set the stage and show you all of the hints that have been dropped about the sun's presence on Azeroth, and Tyr's possible relation to everything. The first hint you can thank Lhok for, because I can safely say without her expertise in Tauren lore, I would never have noticed this fact and in turn figured out its cascading importance. The High Mountain Tauren. They're an interesting bunch, to say the least. Now, with everything I've been over so far, from Anshe to Uldum, what if I told you one of the general farewells of the High Mountain Tauren was Anshe guide you? When I was told this, my mind began to break. I mean, not only was the farewell in our faces consistently in Legion, the Blood of Tauren don't really have an equivalent. I mean, they do have "May the Eternal Sun shine upon thee," but even so, we know they only recently started embracing the sun again. With a farewell like the High Mountains, you'd expect they'd have some connection to the sun, yet when you look at the well-known information about the High Mountain Tauren, it doesn't seem to be the case. The closest connection they seem to have are their druids. That is, until you start digging. Anyone who played Horde during BFA or Legion remembers Lasan Skyhorn, chieftain of the Skyhorn tribe in High Mountain. He's that Tauren with the laugh. You know the one. What do the Skyhorn Tauren ride? Answer: eagles, which at this point I'm hoping have become synonymous with falcons, hawks, phoenixes, and at least a minor connection to the sun. Now, for any hunter out there, the instant response is going to be, yes, the Skyhorn do have a connection to the eagles, but that connection can be mainly traced back to Onahara, the wild god hunters saved when they obtained Talonclaw, the survival hunter legendary. Funny thing about that, this is what's described to have happened during the founding of Talon Peak. Instinctively I held it up to the sky, and all were amazed, none more so than I, to see a cascade of golden energy pour from the spearhead and take the shape of a great eagle. But Gardrell and I remembered the lore of our tribe, and realized Onahara herself had blessed this site. At that very moment we knew this sacred place should be renamed Talon Peak. I should also note, the fields of Anshe just happened to be outside the entrance of Talon Peak. But anyway, golden energy. That is technically an odd occurrence for a wild god that isn't really known to have had a connection to any form of the light. However, here's the other reference connected to the Hunter Legendary, and I swear whoever wrote the lore for Talonclaw hoped someone would find. The High Mountain tribe was led by Chieftain Moraine High Mountain, who saved Onahara, a wild god in the form of a great eagle spirit, from an attack by fire elementals. Now, if your first thought is, oh, he must be talking about the servants of Ragnaros, maybe a firehawk considering everything he's been through, I would completely understand. It's a reasonable conclusion. However, where Onahara may have been attacked by a firehawk or some form of fiery elemental, at this point I can almost guarantee you they did not serve Ragnaros. How am I so certain? Well, who remembers the Yongol Orders on the Timeless Isle? I do, though the only reason why I do is because every time I think about that boss and how I can't access him due to reasons, I pull Sylvanas, dead bodies and all. Anyway, it is quite possible Ordos pulled a Druid of the Flame, Shaman Edition, and that's how he ended up the way he is. With that said, I want to propose that instead of being transformed by elementals of fire, Ordos was actually transformed by the sun, and is another indication the Tauren at some point had a greater relation to the sun than we know and they think. Now, I don't think I need to explain how the sun, or servants of the sun, could be construed for fire elementals considering what the sun literally is, and the fact there have been a myriad of priest and paladin abilities and lore related to fire. So instead I'm just jumping straight to the point. In Chronicle it's made clear all the Tauren variants we see to this day came from the Yongol, that were subjugated and flesh-shaped by the Mogu. What's interesting about this event is that it specifically mentions the Tauren losing a lot of their history during this time. This implies the Tauren myths we have at present, that date back to the creation of Azeroth, are incomplete. The reason I bring this up is that this leaves the possibility that, similar to the Tolvia, at some point there may have been another shift in worship that is not mentioned in the recorded myths of the Tauren. A shift that may explain why the Tauren seem disconnected from the sun, why Onahara was attacked, and why Ordos is apparently on the Eternal Brazier lit by the Eternal Flame that even in death he claims will never be extinguished. I mean, firstly, the Eternal Flame is a concept that is directly connected to the light, as the Eternal Flame in Alonce's Chapel in Stratholme saved the church from the undead. Secondly, ever wonder why the leader of the Grim Totem Tauren, Magatha Grim Totem, went out of her way to get a Wind Serpent familiar, and how that conveniently creates the trio of the Phoenix, the Raven, and the Wind Serpent in Tauren culture? And I guess what I'll put out there is, we know the moon has her chosen. We also know between the Blessed Priestesses and the Night Warrior there is considerable variance in how those blessed can turn out, and the negative side effects. who says the sun doesn't have its own version of this power. The next hint comes in the form of Agramar from Legion, as he is the Titan that empowered Tyr, and so in turn, Tyr, at least in part, reflects Agramar. Two of the major things we learnt about Agramar in Legion were how he fought, and what his purpose in the Titan forging process was. Now, I know I'm beating this point over the head, but Agramar, considering he was basically the paladin of the Pantheon, uses a lot of fire during his boss fight in Antorus. As in, not Fellfire, just fire. I mean, to be honest, if someone didn't know Agramar was Agramar, you could have easily made the argument that we were fighting a specialized Titan-forged fire giant. But once again, what I'm saying about quote-unquote fire elementals will hopefully make a little more sense. The more important aspect we learn about Agramar is Agramar's role in the Titan forging process. During the fight with Argus in the Seat of the Pantheon, we are Titan forged. Over the course of the fight, Titans give us boons in each phase which seem to be indicative of the Titan forging process. Golganeth cleanses our soul, Agramar stabilizes / fortifies it. Norgannon and Amanthal seemingly shape it further on a more fundamental level, and Khazgroth seems to forge the final physical product. And if anything goes wrong, mainly death, Aeonai is there to bring the soul back to the physical universe to start the process all over again. The reason this is important is it shows us the Titans were using the light in more than one way. The power of Raj may have been of creation and destruction, however Tyr, being the keeper of Agramar, would have likely had similar powers, on top of the ability to fortify the soul. Interestingly enough, this may explain the original use and name of the Halls of Valor. What's also intriguing is Atal-Dazar seems to reinforce this idea that Titans were using some form of the light to fortify Azeroth. Priestess Alonza and the Golden Serpent seem to imply gold was used to galvanize tainted blood to stop the corruptive effect, before attempts at purification were attempted. Moving on to Battle for Azeroth, hints to Tyr and the Sun other than the Amentet come in the form of the Kultiran Inquisitors of the Order of Embers in Drustvar, who have a direct connection to House Waycrest, and the Mogu of 8.3. Starting with the smallest hint, all the Mogu who turn up in 8.3 seem to be forms of necromancers, assuming the Island expeditions weren't mentioning another completely different clan of Mogu. The Zantien seem to be the remnants of the Shanzei, Mogu who during Mists of Pandaria showed they had some form of necromantic power in the Terrace of Ten Thunders. On the island of Shanzei Dao, they also demonstrated the ability to animate statues of cloud serpents using this power to create onyx cloud serpents. The Dakani, on the other hand, assumedly have a connection to the ritualists found in TOT trying to control the Dark Animus. With the reveal of Shadowlands, it appears the magic these Mogu clans are using is related to Revendreth and Aventhia. The blood magic of the Dakani being the obvious connection, while the Zantien's control over the wind serpents and their possible connection to the Shanzei's ability to animate statues of cloud serpents may be connected to how the Venthia create gargoyles. The most interesting clan though is the Baruch. In 8.3 we clearly see the Baruch using necromancy to bring their statues to life. We see this through the new standard of animation related to death magic. Now what's intriguing about this is Solux. Solux is a rare female Mogu who shares a lot of similarities with Suen, the twin consort of the Sun from TOT. What makes Solux interesting is she is a general of the Baruch. Now because of how rare female Mogu are, this generally implies the Baruch have some connection to the Sun. For me, this made me wonder if the Baruch's actions in the present reflect or are connected to actions creatures of the Sun may have attempted in the past. I should also mention now, it's rather intriguing how General Xing of the Rajani, another rare occurrence of a female Mogu, shares a lot of similarities with Lulin, the twin consort of the Moon, especially when you consider what side of the conflict each is technically on. Moving on to the bigger hint, the Order of the Embers and the Inquisitors are basically a makeshift light faction, without the overt connection to light magic. I mean, overall, the Order of the Embers managed to create their own holy fire out of alchemy, create their own version of holy weapons out of silver, create its own paladins in the Inquisitors, minus the light, and even create its own doctrine that sounds like a pledge a paladin would take. I mean, listen to this. Brothers and sisters, today you become the searing light that burns away the darkness. Today you become the shining blade that cuts through the wicked. Today you become the beacon of hope against the endless foe. By the authority of House Waycrest, I name you Inquisitors of the Order of Embers. That's a pledge you'd normally associate with every light faction we've seen to date. On top of all of this, they even have a strong connection to the Falcon in the Grey Falcons throughout the area, and the Order's reason for existing, like seemingly always when it comes to these type of orders in World of Warcraft, comes back to an effective way to combat death. Why is all this important? The Order of Embers solidifies 3 very important facts surrounding the light. The first and foremost is a creature does not need a direct connection to the light or its magic to embody its principles or to achieve the same results as someone wielding light magic. There are seemingly highly diluted sources of light present in nature, it's just you have to be a bit creative to use them. The second thing solidified for the umpteenth time is that the light is highly effective against death, which actually leads on to the last solidification. Silver has a connection to the light. Now, if you know your lore, this concept is not new. However, considering its use within the Order of Embers, it is very apparent that its overall connection to light magic is minimal at best. This in turn creates quite a few interesting revelations about Tyr. What do I mean by that? Well, Tyr got his hand bitten off by Galakrond. It was replaced by a literal silver hand forged by Jotun, that watcher that's patrolled the path of the Titans since Wrath. Now, a fun fact I learnt from Lhok is, silver, specifically colloidal silver, can act as an antibacterial. So, considering Galakrond was basically an infectious death/seemingly shadow-ridden monstrosity by the end of its life, the idea Tyr got a silver hand makes sense, as its assumed cleansing powers would have filtered out the necromantic energy suffused into Tyr through the wound. Now, when Tyr died, the place he died was called Tirisfal, or Tyr's Fall. Now, with such a direct naming scheme, you'd think Tyr's hand is where Tyr's hand landed after he caused the explosion that mortally wounded the Sithraxi and ended his life. Apparently, that's not the case though. The hand was in the heart of Tirisfal Glade. However, after the battle, it seemingly dropped off the face of the earth, as in apparently no one knows where this hand went. So the question is, what happened to it? Now, considering the sheer reverence the Vrykul who moved south had for Tyr, I see one of 2 options happening. The first is the Vrykul melted the hand down and turned it into weapons that would one day become sacred to all the early human tribes. The second and more likely option though, is the Vrykul moved the hand to a place where it would never be disturbed and buried it, ensuring no one disturbed the remains of the keeper they revered. However, considering how big the hand was, I wouldn't be surprised if the Vrykul separated pieces off the hand and hid them in multiple locations, explaining why the Vrykul seemingly abandoned Eastwald to the Trolls until their human descendants took the area millennia later. They assumedly didn't want any of their ancestors finding the pieces. This would also explain Thoradin's, the first king of the humans, need to take a pilgrimage to impress the Tarissi humans, the humans who would eventually become Lordoronians, as they seemingly never forgot about the silver hand and treated the symbol of the hand as a sacred image. However, at the same time, never seemingly had the curative silver on them, implying Thoradin may have travelled to the present-day locations of Tyr's Hand, Stratholme, Light's Oak Chapel, and Diantahall as a part of his pilgrimage. Stratholme and Tyr's Hand being quite likely locations, considering even after the Scourging of Lordaeron, Stratholme and Tyr's Hand still produce holy water, implying that purifying effects of the silver may still be active in the area, and explaining why the sites became some of the first holy sites for the Church of the Light. Overall, I think a bit of both possibilities may have happened, and what to do with Tyr's Hand may have been a compounding reason on top of the Curse of Flesh as to why the Vrykul separated into different tribes after Tyr's death, even though all fundamentally admired the same person and his values. Now, the reason all of this is relevant is because at this point, the Vrykul and the humans do not have a connection to the light as we know it today. If anything, you could infer the Tarissi humans were similar to the Order of Embers, minus the constant threat of death magic, to our knowledge. And admittedly, the area was under the constant pull of Tyr and Zakaj's essences, which considering everything would imply a pull between the light and shadow. However, even then, if you were to say compare the humans and the Tol'vir at this point in history, it would be like comparing apples and oranges. Yes, both are technically fruit, but they are still staggeringly different. All of this implies one of two things, or possibly two things about Tyr. The first implication is Tyr may have been of the light and had a light-based weapon like the Silver Hand. However, because his renowned will was so strong, he never lost himself to the light, unlike many others who have used its power. The second possible implication is that the Silver Hand, the actual hand, has greater purifying effects than we originally thought. As in, not only did the effects of the silver fight off the possible shadow and death magic infection, it also, at least in part, may have expelled the extreme aspects of the Holy Light's magic, once again allowing Tyr to retain his person, where others who have been exposed to light for that long begin to lose themselves. This would also imply silver is a purifier of extreme magic as a whole, not just quote-unquote dark/corruptive magics. Oh yeah, before we move on to the next hint, for those who want a fun fact that will make your jaw drop, courtesy of Lhok, IRL silver just happens to have this one peculiar effect when a person is overexposed to the element. That effect is Argyria, which basically turns a person blue. If you're looking at the image on the screen right now, yeah, I know, that is a massive hint/explanation/near perfect, oh, that's what's going on with the Kyrian and Bastion. The only thing I can really add to this is wait till the end. I may have figured out why they are doing it. These circumstances surrounding Tyr and the first humans lead on to the last hint related to the sun on Azeroth. As you already know, the humans eventually did develop deep connections to the Holy Light, and in turn, that connection eventually led to the creation of the first human paladins on Azeroth, and the Order of the Silver Hand. This was facilitated by the Church of the Holy Light, a church that was fundamentally set up by the Naaru through influencing the minds of selfless humans after the Troll Wars, like Mereldar, the sister of Lordain, the person Lordaeron is named after. Now, the question surrounding the Church of the Holy Light and its influence on the humans comes down to a question of why now? Why specifically after the Troll Wars did the Naaru suddenly start paying attention to the humans? I mean, for all intents and purposes, it seems as if they could have influenced the humans at any point in time, so why after the Troll Wars? The implication seems to be the sacrifice of Lordain to ensure victory over the Trolls, as his death is directly connected to Mereldar's actions of becoming a priest, and in turn creating the Church of the Holy Light. And where Lordain's death is a major part of the reason and makes some very interesting connections, there is also another reason I need to mention first. You see, something we've known for a very long time now is Azeroth is seemingly hidden by a protective veil, arguably multiple veils. These veils for the most part stop certain creatures getting in and others getting out. Now, considering the difficulty of bypassing these veils, which almost always require someone on Azeroth to open the door, the Naaru being the exception to the rule this early in Azeroth's history doesn't make much sense, even if they are just projecting visions. This is where the first 100 human mages come into play. You see, where for the most part fire mages create the fire they use, the first 100 mages didn't actually create the fire that decimated the Armani. They technically summoned it. I mean, if the event being called Fire from the Heavens didn't give it away, what the fire actually does should. The sorceress flames burned lower and troll alike from the inside out. Those flames burned lower, meaning they burned spirits. And I'm certain it wasn't normal elemental fire as we're dealing with fire mages, raising the glaring question, where did that fire come from? Now, I have mentioned in other content the notion that frost and fire mages use fire and water but actually control the power of heat and frost, hot and cold. The idea being the elements that are most easily affected by these principles are fire and water, but fundamentally mages are using a different form of magic than shamans. Taking that notion further, I then asked, why hot and cold? And the only reference that seems to explain why those two specific notions is Seath and Rukmar. Seath being the cold-blooded, shadow-related serpent that wished to bask in the sun, Serpents IRL notoriously being cold-blooded animals, while on the other hand, there's Rukma being the Phoenix, which just happens to be universally associated with fire mages and their magic in World of Warcraft, as seen with the Blood Elves and their notorious mages and symbols, to even the Tauren as demonstrated by the Horde version of the Jadefire Masters, implying Frost and Fire mages deal with very, very specific aspects of the Shadow and the Light, specifically the cold of the Shadow and the heat of the Light. This, yes, overall does imply I am saying those mages called on the power of something related to the light that is excruciatingly powerful, and by doing so, they also weaken the Veil enough to alert the Naru of Azeroth, or at the very least her location, and allow them to start influencing the humans. The interesting tidbit that supports this are the dwarves, specifically Dwarven Paladins. If Dwarven Paladins weren't specifically stated to be a thing, you could easily make the argument they were a player-only thing, or after BFA, a Dark Iron-only thing. Dwarven Paladins are very rare. Turns out though, the Stormpikes might be the clan of Paladins within Ironforge. In Legion, within the Paladin Order Hall, there is a statue of General Lena Stormpike. This is the first reference to Lena in World of Warcraft. What's stunning about the reference, other than the fact that Lena is a Dwarven Paladin, is that she is a Stormpike, as in the dwarves fighting in Alterac Valley. So firstly, she could have quite possibly been Vandar Stormpike's equal, as she was a general, if not superior, depending on the family relation before her death. Secondly, Lena's existence throws a lot of questions out there about what the Stormpikes have actually been after since they moved into Alterac Valley, since we know dwarves are drawn to Titan ruins. Couple this with the fact they might be a heavily light-related clan, and the question becomes, is there something relating to the Titans and the light in Alterac? And if there is, does it have something to do with what the first Stupid Mages pulled off in Alterac, and the start of the Naru's influence on the humans? This is where Lordain's sacrifice comes into scope, and a fact that I honestly didn't know existed until I was getting feedback on this script. I mean, this fact is blatant and amazing, but geez, I wish I'd picked up on this earlier, because adding more to this theory in any way, shape or form was completely quacked. Anyway, because of my resident Tauren expert, I realised I overlooked what the Yine in Tauren culture actually were. The Yine are basically honoured Tauren ancestors that have died saving lives and or creating lives. These are the types of spirit that go to Arnshe and help Arnshe when he bleeds to signal the dawn is coming. Lordain and his forces died in one of the most selfless ways possible, arguably saving two cultures at once, the High Elves and the humans. Now, where I know Lordain wasn't a Tauren, here's the connection that I normally would never touch on because I know what reaction it's going to get, and because of how unreliable the source generally is. However, when you don't go looking for certain information but find some that lines up this perfectly to such a niche theory, it is incredibly hard to ignore. Hearthstone, Rustichan's Rumble, Janali, the Firehawk gets added as a legendary card for mages. Battlecry, if you've dealt 8 damage with your hero power, which by default for mages is Fire Blast, summon Ragnaros, the Firelord. To explain the connection here, as mentioned, the fire the first 100 mages summoned may not have been their own. If anything, the only thing they did was rip a hole in the veil. The fire probably came from Arnshe, because Lordain and his 500 men proved themselves to be Yine, which probably empowered Arnshe by a ridiculous amount, so that when the mages did open the door, Arnshe let loose the Wrath of the Sun on the Armani, creatures it probably considered heretical for worshipping Janali, a creature that was probably spawned by or subordinate to Arnshe at some point. What's terrifying about this though is those mages may have broken the veil to such an extent that Arnshe was able to bring its flames through the Firelands, or worse yet, exert control over the Firelands. And where I know I must sound like I'm selling Ragnaros short, think about it like this. Ragnaros and Alkir were innately corrupted by N'Zoth during Cataclysm, and it's generally why they served him without question. Who's to say something else of equal power, if not more power, could do the same to a certain section of the Firelands or any other parts of the Elemental Plane when enough of an opening is provided. Also, if you've done the Dark Iron Dwarf Allied Race questline, you know there is a sect of Dark Irons looking to bring back Ragnaros, and where I know this concept is basically a meme, if the sun does have as much influence as I think it does, in particularly over the element of fire, Ragnaros the Light Lord, servant of the sun, is a lot more plausible than you'd expect. I should also state that yes, I am inadvertently saying Arnshe might be locked behind a veil in some form of titanic prison similar to the Elemental Plane, which, after the Troll Wars, may have been weakened around Alterac. I am also inadvertently hinting at the notion that Naru, who began showing visions to the humans, may have been locked in the same prison as Arnshe. Or if we go with Khadgar's Loon theory being plausible, Arnshe might have had something to do with the Naru's creation, if not is just extremely similar to them in nature, as in the Yine help Arnshe as he bleeds to signal the dawn. The only thought that comes to mind for me when picturing that is how alternate Velen, being of pure spirit, was able to purify and empower Kahara, the Dark Star of alternate Draenor, and makes me wonder if Arnshe works on a similar premise. This possibility also gives another very good reason for why the Halls of Valor may have existed in the first place. It may have been the facility that stopped spirits from being drawn and fed to the sun, and why Lordain's death may have seen him become a Yine and resulted in the Firestorm, as in because Odin hijacked the Halls of Valor millennia ago, to our knowledge the facility for the most part stopped serving as a buffer for Arnshe. So when Lordain died, his spirit may have been called to, and or forcefully taken to the sun, and thinking about it, this also creates some really off questions about that vision Anduin had of Varian on the Broken Shore, and who/what Anduin actually saw. To start explaining the theory behind this myriad of information, we start with the sun. Arnshe, the assumed equal of Elune, is basically MIA on Azeroth. It is very doubtful this occurred without something assumedly bad happening, raising a plethora of whos, whats, and whys. Through Uldum, it becomes clear Azeroth has gods similar to the Arrakoan gods on the planet. Arnshe being the Rukmar, Falcon/Hawk/Eagle/Firebird/Phoenix equivalent, Bonsamdi most likely being the Anzu, Raven/Crow equivalent, and Takar being the Seethe Windserpent equivalent. Through the visages used on the Watchers of Uldum, it can be inferred the Titans had some form of interaction with all of the Azerothian equivalents of these gods. The most likely scenario is the Raven and the Phoenix were inducted into another pantheon of Loa similar to the Wild Gods, and possibly tied to another realm similar to the Dream. The Watchers of Uldum also imply something else. Isaset, the Watcher of Magic, is the only humanoid-faced Watcher in comparison to the others. The implication is at some point in the timeline the Raven was most likely changed into a different form, and raised to the position of the moon, becoming a loon. This was most likely done using the Obelisk of the Stars and the Ascension ritual related to the obelisk. Following this revelation, another of the Arrakoan gods needs to be acknowledged, specifically the Raven Mother. Assuming the similarities in personalities carry over, the characteristics of the Raven Mother match that of a loon. Both see the necessity in balance, both purposely have little to no interaction with the mortal world, and both give compassion to those that are not their own, and invite them into their own families. In the case of the Raven Mother, it was adopting the outcasts as a part of her flock. In the case of Elune, it was transforming the Dark Trolls into elves. With the revelation the Raven Mother was most likely the Raven depicted in Uldum, and the connection to Elune established, one glaring question follows. Why was Azeroth's Raven Mother transformed in the first place, and why does the moon seemingly have the powers attributed to the sun? The first assumption is the Titans did what they usually do and changed things according to their will, which is possible, however, with the very prominent existence of sun-related Titan Forge like the Amentet and Raj, it's quite apparent they were willing to use the power of the sun, and for the most part did not see a reason to seal the power away or transfer it to another being. The next likely culprits to have transformed the Raven Mother are the Keepers. If the Fetid Devourer and the Binding of the Wild Gods is any indication, the Keepers were quite willing to alter Loa. This is where Tyr becomes very important. Assuming Tyr, at least in part, served the same purpose as his Titan equivalent Agramar, it can be assumed Tyr's main duty was to ensure the safety and integrity of Azeroth's souls, or the souls of the Titanforged, possibly both. This was most likely done with the Halls of Valor, and locations like Stormheim, which contained places like Agramar's Vault. Now, as the story goes, after the departure of the Pantheon, Tyr is described as being the only active keeper on Azeroth. So other than looking after his own section of interest, he also looked after most of Azeroth because the other keepers had become reclusive and apathetic. Now in Dawn of the Aspects, it is heavily implied that Tyr is in part responsible for Galakrond going mad, and it is heavily implied he had been experimenting with the Proto-Drakes trying to create new protectors of Azeroth. This circumstance leads on to two possibilities depending on whether you think these events happened before or after Galakrond. The first possibility, assuming everything happened before Galakrond, is Tyr wasn't only experimenting on dragons. Prior to Galakrond, Tyr may have tried elevating Arnshe using the Obelisk of the Stars, the logic being the light, at least at first, made Arnshe appear to be a noble creature worthy of the role. This assumption went horribly wrong, however, possibly in a similar fashion to Galakrond, and Tyr was forced to lock away Arnshe, as he may have begun to use the souls of the Valorous to become incredibly powerful. In the process, Tyr may have had to transfer most of Arnshe's power to another creature, specifically the Raven Mother, and in the process create a loon. Tyr's experiment may have also resulted in Bonsamdi's current state, and Waihakar has an exposed chest cavity. The second possibility, and the possibility that I think is most likely in relation to this part of the theory, is after Galakrond and gaining the Silver Hand, Tyr started to gain more clarity in relation to the light's magic. I think he started to realize the extremes of light were just as bad as the extremes of the shadow. The reason for this is Galakrond's fall and his need to consume seems to have something to do with being empowered by the sparks of Tyr, artifacts that have been shown to fluctuate between the light and the shadow, implying they have a close connection to the extremes of the light and the shadow. Now, with this new perspective, I think Tyr started to travel Azeroth and started to notice the injustices being perpetrated by creatures related to the light, which, after everything I've mentioned in this theory, wouldn't really have been that hard to find. I mean, when looking at the light as a whole, between crazed zealotry which would see planets burn, as seen with the Amenethet, addiction which I haven't mentioned but is something you can see in some Morkadesco, Kaelia Benethil before she was dead, and growing in Anduin if you've read Before the Storm, complete servitude that would see people surrender all independent will, and the sheer arrogance and pride related to those of the light, which can see people act in the most heinous of manners, it really wouldn't have been that hard for Tyr to find what he may have started to suspect. This is where Tyr, Uldum, Arnshe and the Tauren most likely converged. Assuming Arnshe at this point was some form of Titan chosen lower which had some relative influence on Azeroth, I would be willing to guess Arnshe started to become zealous, power hungry, and overall probably started to get a god complex. A complex so large, this Mayan deity probably started to do things against the Titan's will. However, I think Arnshe eventually did two specific things that broke the camel's back and without question drew the eyes of the newly enlightened Tyr. The first thing Arnshe probably did was use the Obelisk of the Stars to ascend himself, granting him way more power than he originally had, which was considerable to begin with. They have also done this to their followers, possibly creating types of Naru. The second thing I think they started to do was mess with dead spirits, once again specifically powerful and valorous ones, and started to use them to empower himself. The reason I think this is twofold. As we see with the Nightmare, light magic is quite susceptible to the Shadow's influence, yet when you compare the light's effect on life magic it seems rather weak. Which, considering plants and photosynthesis probably being a thing in World of Warcraft, it kind of makes a lot of sense. On the flip side, with death, it seems to be the complete opposite. The light is very effective against death magic, and the shadow is seemingly weak against it. Overall, it seems as if dead spirits were an easy target for Arnshe. Couple this with the Brook Mogu seemingly being sun-related Mogu that use necromancy to empower their statues, and it's not as if there is a precedent for this. Now, as I mentioned before, Tyr seems to have been related to the protection and fortification of souls. So if any of the keepers were going to notice what was going on, it was going to be Tyr. especially if we consider the concept of anima and how your deeds in life can turn your soul into a powerful fuel source. Tyr, being the best fighter in the Pantheon, was probably tasked with looking after this power. Now, assuming this theory is right, Tyr and his allies, which at this point I would assume were any species on Azeroth at the time with a grudge against Arnshe, including the Tol'vir, Tauren, Trolls and some lower, were able to stop whatever god-ascending plan Arnshe had. There was just one problem. I don't think Tyr at the time had the capability of killing Arnshe. Now, whether this was because of the Ascension ritual, or the fact that I think all of this happened concurrently with Odin raising the Halls of Valor and possibly removing Tyr's ability to kill Arnshe, is something I'm unsure of. However, I am convinced instead of killing Arnshe, Tyr imprisoned him and his most devout followers with the help of the Raven Mother and possibly Arcadis. Arcadis most likely building new prisons around Azeroth to hold the entities, possibly creating one under Alterac, while Tyr and the Raven Mother subdued Arnshe. To do this, I think Tyr ascended the Raven Mother to become a deity of the moon, and in the process figured out a way to transfer Arnshe's newfound power to her, in the process creating a Loon, a ridiculously powerful Loa with a mix of arcane and light abilities. After these events unfolded, I would be willing to assume this is where the sun and worship of the sun start to disappear. The cultures that had known about Arnshe, like the Tol'vir and the Tauren, probably moved on, slowly filtering out the sun, knowing how dangerous it was. Then as time moved on, and the Keepers fell, the re-origination of Uldum happened, and the enslavement of Tauren occurred, in turn, the history of the sun, and to an extent the moon, were forgotten, which overall is a very, very bad thing. For as hinted at with Ornahara, Ordos, and Lordain, the sun's influence may have faded, but it most certainly hasn't died. If anything, it's probably been trying to escape, has been looking for ways to spread its influence, and is quite apparently not benevolent in its methods. When the humans ripped the veil, I think they may have tapped into the prison of Arnshe and started a chain of events that's going to see an enemy equal to a Loon, if not more powerful than a Loon, turn up out of nowhere and start causing major problems. As the Black Empire is bad, but an Empire of the Sun, I guarantee you, is equal in all its depravity. Now, as conclusions go in relation to this theory, that is the more grounded version. That fits rather nicely with most of the information we have in World of Warcraft so far. However, it doesn't address the rather glaring pieces of lore that make large pieces of this theory invalid, or make little to no sense. The main issue being when certain events happened and their relation to the past. This leads on to the more quacked conclusion. The conclusion I'd argue is lore breaking. Not in the sense that it breaks the law, it's just that if any of this quacked conclusion is even remotely accurate, the term monolithic isn't going to cover the magnitude of universe-changing lore drops we are going to get in the near future. What am I talking about? Well, I didn't mention the idea of things being older than the Titan's presence on Azeroth or possibly the Black Empire for no reason. There's just one fun fact I need to state before we get into the rest of this quacked theory. Wind serpents are cousins of cloud serpents, and when flesh-shaped enough, the amalgamation that forms from a cloud serpent is a hydra. Why is that important? Well, one of the oddest bits of lore surrounding Kakar is that he can apparently only be summoned in Zul'Gurub. There is basically little to no explanation behind that until you realise something about Pandaria. Y'Shaarj breathed on Pandaria forever, changing the land. The assumption is that is what caused the Shah, and in part it may have. However, the heart of Y'Shaarj seemed to be the major contributor to the Shah's existence. So the question is, why mention the idea Y'Shaarj breathed on the land in the first place? The only answer that really exists within Pandaria is that it creates an ambiguous connection to Uldum, the Jaded Serpent, who breathes on statues to reincarnate herself. Interestingly enough, this connection is the final puzzle piece that explains the odd bit of lore surrounding Kakar, because as I mentioned, wind serpents and cloud serpents are supposed to be cousins, meaning similar things happen to each species when exposed to certain conditions. Y'Shaarj was the god of 7 heads, and I personally don't think that is a metaphor. I think Y'Shaarj was literally a 7-headed god by the end of its life, specifically a hydra. Now, we could assume all 7 heads breathed on one location, but what if they didn't? What if all 7 heads breathed on different parts of the world, infusing the land with different forms of corruption? Worse yet, what if, similar to the heart of Y'Shaarj, the heads of Y'Shaarj landed in these separate locations and happened to turn into their own independent creatures? Creatures that were eventually caught, experimented on, and altered by the Titans. Now, just so we're on the same page, yes, I am saying Uldum, Hakkar, Quetzalcoatl, and maybe Thoranja were the heads of Y'Shaarj. And considering this pattern has followed the major Zulls outside of Zuldazar, as in each tribe has a wind serpent present within its pantheon, there is a distinct possibility that Moizala may have been the wind serpent of Zal-F, and Janali, the very odd, possibly altered Dragonhawk, may have been the wind serpent of Zal-A, flesh-shaped together with a firehawk. The joke is, that's only 6 names, there is still a missing head. 2 if you assume Zal-Drak only had 1 head land in its vicinity, but sticking with only 1 head being left, it's rather funny how the last name makes a perfect 7, that name possibly being Y'Shaarj, and possibly hinting at a missing Zul on Azeroth. Anyway, how does this connect to the overall theory? The answer is blood magic / flesh shaping. To create a Hydra out of a cloud serpent, all you have to do is flesh shape it in a similar way to the Mogu, and the resulting mess will turn into a Hydra. Now, you remember how I mentioned Seed and Hakkar seemed familiar? And how I mentioned Bwonsamdi may be the Anzu equivalent on Azeroth? And how he may have had wings once upon a time? And had been connected to the Kyrian? Also remember how Skirtish Hollow seems like a toned down version of Nazmir? And do you know how Nazmir is arguably the home of blood magic on Azeroth? Well, at this point I'm hoping it's all starting to come together. There is just one more bit of information you need to know. AQ, Uldum, Pandaria, Suramar, in particularly Pandaria and Suramar, reinforce the idea there are places on Azeroth that can be a part of the world yet completely isolated from everything else and be fully functional societies. Nazmir just happens to have a hidden piece of lore which implies a place called Zal-Nazman existed on the site of Uldir. This lore talks of invincible walls, how the lore watched over them, and how they will stand forever. There's just one problem. The existence of Zal-Nazman does not fit into the known timeline of the Trolls. Zuldazar is the earliest known Zul of the Trolls. Now, you could make the argument Zal-Nazman must have existed during the era of the Titans, and it's quite possible it did. However, that would contradict the Trolls' worship of the Loa, as they were literal test subjects of the Titans, leaving 2 eras we know of that Zal-Nazman may have existed in, the Black Empire and the Reign of the Elements. Now, where we know Loa can constitute old god-like figures, the lack of Shathiar, original old god influence, and the need for walls considering Zandalar's location on Pangaea Azeroth doesn't add up, leaving one specific era left, the Reign of the Elements. And we know, thanks to Shadows of the Horde, there has likely been Loa around since the formation of Azeroth. Then, when you consider the need for invincible walls and the need to be protected by the Loa, it's not much of a stretch to assume what those walls were defending against, considering the carnage the Elemental Lords were wreaking at the time. This implies the only time Zal-Nazman could have existed was during the Reign of the Elements. And just to be clear, yes, I am saying Zal-Nazman was a precursor civilization that predated the Black Empire. What's rather funny though is when you consider the inexplicable age of Uldum and the defense mechanism of sealing the region off from the rest of the world, which if I'm not mistaken no other Titan facility has demonstrated, on top of Black Rockhold, the home of the Raven Lord, and the Temple of Elune / Suramar's relatively close proximity to each other, both existing on the Broken Isle and the Isle itself just happening to be eerily related to the Shadowlands, what you get are 3 precursor civilizations. One of the Serpent in Zal-Nazman, one of the Ravens in Suramar, and one of the Phoenix in Uldum, all of which I'd be willing to bet were diverse in the races that existed within them, as in it's quite possible they contained Kyrian, Tol'vir, and Tauren. It is also likely they had some interactions with each other, sharing similar gods and beliefs. I would also be willing to say all probably fell around the same time because of each other. You see, if these civilizations did worship the Azerothian equivalents of the Arrakoan gods, and were similar in their relations to each other, then it is highly likely events played out in a similar fashion to what happened on Draenor, just quite literally on a larger, world-ending scale instead. But what do I mean? Well, if there was a precursor civilization of the Wind Serpent, then it is likely they had blood magic / blood rituals surrounding that serpent, and eventually they may have headed on a warpath with the civilization of the Phoenix, similar to the Arrakoa and their gods. However, on Azeroth, for some reason, the practices of blood within the civilization of Zal-Nazman were outlawed. The question is why, until you read Bwonsamdi, the Raven god who meddles in the affairs of mortals / those who are not under his purview, was made the royal lower of assumedly Zal-Nazman. This most likely kicked off the conflict between the Raven and the Serpent, the result being similar to that on Draenor, but at the cost of the Raven's form, soul, and a piece of the land which it had set out to protect. What's worse than Draenor though is the Serpent on Azeroth may have instead succeeded in dooming the world. As was hopefully understood earlier, the Serpent, due to the blood magic at play, may have turned itself into a Hydra, and become what we know as Y'Shaarj, the god of 7 heads, and quite possibly upon its first death, transformed its remains into the most powerful old god, and in the process beckoned the shadow to Azeroth, kicking off the Black Empire and climbing to the peak of its power. However, there is also one other possibility that relates to this part of the theory. The Serpent may have been defeated, and the Raven cursed in the process. However, those afflicted by the curse, instead of humbling the civilization of the Phoenix, could have started a crusade against those the Phoenix considered corrupted by the Serpent's power. This is where the Raven Mother and the Phoenix would have come into conflict, for where the Raven Mother may not like interfering in mortal affairs, she will step in when times become dire enough, as is seen when she helps us defeat the adherents in Warlords of Draenor. At the end of this conflict, the Raven Mother would have won, assumedly taking the power of the sun and becoming a loon, while locking away the Phoenix to service the sun we see today. And where this would fit nicely, there is just one problem stemming from a fact I've been holding on to this entire theory. In the Temple of the Jade Serpent, we are told through a boss fight that Azeroth once upon a time had 5 suns. 4 were shot down, and 1 was left in the sky. The civilization of the Phoenix may have created the Obelisk of the Stars before the Titans arrived, and may have elevated others to a position similar to that of the Phoenix. And maybe, just maybe, as the Raven Mother defeated each of these ascended, with the help of certain Azerothian species like the Shahalo, and possibly took the powers of these false suns, they fell, falling from the sky drained of their light, and as they plummeted, shifted to entities of shadow. Upon impact, warping everything they touched and transforming into mounds of hungering flesh that could create their own life, transforming into old gods. What's rather funny about this theory is in Chronicle Volume 3, we got a hint at there being 5 old gods. So if you go with both possibilities surrounding the civilization of the Serpent and the Phoenix happening concurrently, you actually get a reason for why 5 old gods emerged on Azeroth around the same time. One was created from the cursed blood of the Serpent, while the other 4 were created by the hunger and hubris of the light. With that said, I would actually be implying there were originally 8 old gods. 7 if you discount Anzu's Raven equivalent, who technically would have ended up considerably weaker than the other gods, and would have probably gotten kicked out of his god status, or possibly abandoned it for a time after it was cursed. This implies Nazmir would have been ground zero for the creation of Y'Shaarj, and why the Titans' earliest experiments were located in the region. Overall, to answer the initial question of this theory, the reason Arnshe was locked away and seemingly stricken from the record was because him and the Serpent basically ensured the Black Empire's existence and fundamentally destroyed the planet, which saw the Black Empire rise and the loss of most history before the Empire's rise. The Titans probably found remnants of these civilizations during the war with the Black Empire, and if I was to guess, made contact with a loon, explaining this one line from Chronicle Volume 1 that has bugged me for ages. The Keepers and their allies. What allies? At this point in the book, it seemed rather odd to start calling the Titanforged allies of the Keepers. This partnership between the Loon and the Titans probably culminated in the fall of the Black Empire. However, after that, your guess is as good as mine, as it seems the Moon decided to stay in a rather reserved role until it altered the Dark Trolls and created the Night Elves. Then again, considering the Raven Mother's personality, that would explain the connection to the Shadowlands. Oh right, I didn't explain that part. What happened to Uldum after the defeat and imprisonment of the Sun, possibly in the Northern Eastern Kingdoms, and the rise of the Black Empire. I mentioned before the Raven Mother on Draenor knew the destruction of Draenor was coming, so for whatever reason, she had semi-accurate foresight, which, considering the Night Elves' connection to Uldum, may explain Star Augur Atreus's and Elisan's powers. Now, the Raven Mother promised her flock she would take them to her Dark Realm to protect them from the destruction. If Uldum and the Raven Mother are supposed to be similar characters, and in turn both made a similar promise, and Bonsam had wings similar to a Kyrian before the curse, then my assumption is, with the power Uldum gathered from the suns, she probably fulfilled the promise and created Oribus, and the Shadowlands we are going to see, to escape the Black Empire. And yes, I am implying Uldum is the Arbiter, is that old, and the eerily weird connection that can be made between the Broken Isle and the Shadowlands is no coincidence. They're similar because Uldum probably attempted to make her perfect, quote-unquote, purified dream in the image of her people's homeland. In the present, we see remnants of these civilizations, as hopefully demonstrated by the evidence I've provided over the course of this theory, and I think Shadowlands is going to reveal the Sun, and even the Serpent, are very close to making a return. I should also mention, where I have connected the 4 missing suns to the elk gods, there is a possibility they were never connected to them. The reason why is that the only other reference in-game that seems to connect the 5 suns are the 5 sisters, the rock formation in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, where you can find Solux during the Mogu invasions, and oddly enough, another manted paragon unearthed in the middle of the stones during the manted invasions. Anshe is a he, so he wouldn't be considered a sister, meaning if the 5 sisters are connected to the suns, then Azeroth is missing 5 celestial objects, specifically suns, technically 6 if you take into consideration the Shrine of the 2 Moons and the Shrine of the 7 Stars, assuming the suns are being equated to stars. The final joke of this theory is I thought I would completely disprove the existence of the Void Lords creating this. Turns out though, they still fit in rather nicely as a mystery to still be discovered. As yeah, the elements may have been the reason the 3 civilizations established themselves to begin with, but if Uldum did create Oribus, then the indication is the civilizations probably knew about them more, which, as threats go, is considerably more dangerous, and until confirmed otherwise, the Maw and Jailor could still have connections to the Void Lords. And B, don't think I forgot about the other Uldum Watchers. The Jackal and the Ram are curious because of their magical alignments. One represents life similar to the Evergrowth, which is not a good thing I might add, while the Jackal represents chaos. However, does not seem to represent any type of chaos magic we've seen before, and instead looks like he is connected to the Shadow, raising the possibility the Jackal may have been or is related to the Void Lords. But for now, we are at the end. I will probably do content on those concepts at a later date, but for now, this theory has definitely gone on long enough. Thank you for watching.